Hello everybody, today I want to show you how you can spice up your structures inside of your Psytrance track. Now this video is going to be two parts. I'm going to quickly go over some of the basics of the structures of a Psytrance track, and then we'll look at taking some of the rules that we learned in the first part and breaking them in interesting ways. Now this isn't going to be as extensive as it could be. I have a much bigger video that goes over a lot more arrangement stuff. So for today I mainly just want to keep it simple, and the project that we're going to be taking a look at is this one over here, which I've shown off many times before. As you can see, structure-wise, it is a fairly simple structure in that we have an intro, of course, over here. We have our first drop, we have our second drop, and then finally over here we have our third drop and outro. And while this is a fairly conventional structure for a Psytrance track, there's a lot of things that we're doing in here to keep things interesting. Now I want to start off with having a few MIDI tracks over here. When it comes to making structures for Psytrance tracks, what I often like to do is lay it out in MIDI because it's a nice visual representation of what you're actually doing. The very first thing that I want to do is I actually want to lay out parts of 8 bars. So I'm going to make an 8-bar part over here. I'm going to duplicate it, and then I'm just going to color one of them white and another one of them black so that they are nice and distinguishable. And then I'm just going to duplicate this over. So now we have like a clean indication of every part where the 16 bars end, because the main way that you're going to be writing Psytrance music is in segments of 16 bars. So the most traditional form of a structure is going to be something like this, where we're going to have an intro. I like this color for my intro. Then we're going to have a part of an intro with a kick and bass that is being filtered in some interesting way. And then the first drop is probably going to happen over here. Now what you'll find is that I'm going to make a segment of 15 bars over here so that we can write out the drop. And then we can write out the fill separately for this last part over here. And you can see that that neatly lines up with our 16-bar grid over here. And then we can duplicate that over a couple of times. Usually what you'll find is that there's 4 segments to a drop. And then there's usually a little breakdown. So this is still going to be the most common form of the Psytrance track. We're going to have the breakdown like this in this color. And then we'll have another segment of the drop. 1, 2, 3, like that. And then you're going to have a longer breakdown, usually something like 32 bars. And then you will have your final drop over here. I will duplicate that over as well. And then you're going to have something like an outro, which is just going to be a more calmer version of the kick and bass. And then finally, you're going to have your fade out, which obviously is a little bit variable because it's going to depend on how long the delay tails are going to be. Now, if you're a beginner in structuring or you want to write a very standardized structure for a Psytrance track, this is the way to go. This is probably the most common format that you're going to find in terms of structures. And this is a nice starting off point to get just your ideas into the track and that you can then expand upon. So what we can essentially say is that if you write a Psytrance track in this form, in this structure over here, it is going to work. And the cool thing is, it depends a little bit on the elements that you have. So say that, for example, you want to have a second drop that is a little bit shorter. Maybe you want something like a progressive bass line in there, like a groovy bass line as opposed to your standard rolling bass line. You can just take away parts and the structure to a certain extent will still hold up. If I do something like this, you can see that we get a little bit of a shorter track. Yes, that is true. But structurally wise, this will still work. So even though we're technically straying away now from the most standard form of the structure, you're still going to get structures adjacent to it that work really well for your Psytrance track. And it's really unlikely that the structure that you're going to write is just not going to work, for example, in a DJ set, like it's going to be hard to mix it in or something like that. There's a very small chance that that will actually happen, as long as you keep to a structure that looks somewhat like this. Now, when it comes to the energy of your track, I like to divide that up into 3 different segments for the drops. So you're going to have low energy segments, you're going to have medium energy segments, and you're going to have high energy segments. And I just want to write out how that is probably going to look. So I'll have like low energy in this color, and then I'll have medium energy maybe in this color over here, and then these are going to be the high energy ones. And then over here, you can either go with a low energy and medium energy. It depends a little bit at this point how you're actually going to transition into this drop over here. The same is going to be true over here. After the breakdown, you're probably going to have a more low energy part over here. And then you slowly need to build it up again till you get to the high energy parts over here. And this is where you can really go loose. And then you go into the outro where the DJ is going to mix into the next track. Now, of course, as I said, it's going to depend a little bit on how you transition into stuff. Sometimes you may have like a very strong buildup over here, and then it doesn't really make sense to go from this very high moment into a moment that is just like very calm and very small and very low energy. So maybe what happens is that you go immediately into like the medium energy and you have a little bit more time to stay in the higher energies over here as well. So of course, again, you can be a little bit variable with this kind of stuff, but what you'll often find for most types of Psytrance especially for the progressive stuff, the stuff that I tend to make, is that it just kind of slowly comes in. And this has to do with like the sequences that you're using. It has to do with the one-shots that you're using. Usually it's the case that the lowest energy parts are where the one-shots mainly play. The medium energy parts is like a combination of some sequences and some one-shots. And then you have the high energy parts where it's mainly focused towards the sequences. But the main indication of the energy is going to be the drums. And when it comes to the drums, they have a very specific role within the energy of your track because they are the most like unique identifier of what the energy of a certain segment actually is. Now, quick intermission just so that I can say that if you see this video before the 25th of August, then you can get 30% off of all of my products over on my Gumroad page. So if you're interested in that, make sure that you go check that out. So let's actually dive into the project itself. I know we've been just playing with MIDI clips over here, but let's actually dive into the project itself to look at what is going on inside of the drums here. What you'll find is that for the low energy parts, we either have no drums whatsoever. In this project, it's a little bit special because I am actually already kind of putting in some drums over there. So in this case, what I would say is that this segment of the drop is the more low energy. And then here we're kind of transitioning already into the medium energy. And over here, what you'll see is that we go into the high energy parts. So the high energy parts is really where all of your drums are going to be. And the main drum that is going to indicate that something is high energy is going to be this open hat over here. That nice piercing open hat sound that you hear on the offbeat is of course really energetic and really powerful. You can hear what kind of massive amount of energy you get in the track if you turn it on. You get this nice offbeat groove from this element, and it's a very piercing kind of element as well. So overall, it's just like a very high energy element. And therefore, I would say that the open hat is the main indication for whether something is high energy. Now, as I said before, when it comes to the structure, we tend to keep to something that is a little bit more standardized, even within the structure of this track, which I'm later going to talk about how it differs from other structures. There's still, you're going to see that there's like some standardization happening within the way that the energy flows, within the way that overall the track progresses and all of that stuff. And there's a few reasons for that. I actually want to kind of talk a little bit about an example of somebody else's track. I'm not going to play it because that is not really necessary for now. All that you need to know about that track is that I got it actually submitted to me in the feedback stream that I did yesterday. Today is Monday when I'm recording this. And throughout almost all of the drops, they had their offbeat hat playing, starting from the very first moment of the drop. So what they would have is something like this. If I just take the offbeat hat here, they would have this playing over here. And then slowly all of the other elements would build around it. And maybe on the first thought, this sounds like it makes sense in the sense that when you just hear it on its own, it's not really that high energetic, right? Like if we just play this. It sounds like a slower element if you just play it like this on its own than, for example, the closed hat. So if we have the closed hat over here, this is of course faster. So you would think like, okay, that's an indication of something being faster, being more energetic. But that's not really the case because you have to think about how these elements actually function within the context of the whole groove, within the context of the whole drum loop that you have. And within that drum loop, the highest energy is actually coming from the offbeat hat. So that is why we tend to turn that on the last. Now, personally, what I like to do is I like to go with kick and bass and then starting off with some drum loops, stuff like that. And then going up into the closed hats. And then as you can see, at some points, the snare comes in as well. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll have them come in together like this. Of course, I would duplicate this over here as well. Sometimes I might choose to start with the snare first, but personally, I'm a little bit more of a fan of getting the hats in there first and then later on turning on the snare as well. I just think overall that this is a nice way to kind of build up the track like this. So if you listen to this whole segment over here, you can hear how it's going to build into the higher energy over here. And notice how the drums are really like the indication of what is actually happening energy-wise. So you can really hear, especially towards the end over here, how the energy is like building up, mainly of course because we also have a build-up over here. And then we raise the energy and you can hear, even in the synths, like there's an indication of, okay, some high energy stuff is coming, and then we get the impact of this drop over here, and then it pays off, and this is where you get the really high energy parts. This is also where we have the high energy sequences, like this stuff over here. So all of that stuff starts to play over there. We're no longer relying a lot on one-shots, as you can see. Whereas before we have a lot more one-shots in here. Yes, there's a sequence in here as well, but this is like very soft and not very high energy. So the main high energy part is happening over here, as you can see. Now these kind of waves that I'm building up also happen over here. We can see again that we have a kick and bass here. This is maybe even a better example. Yes, it is true that there's an other drum loop over here, this orchestral loop, but of course this isn't like the main top loop. The main top loop actually starts to come in over here, where we can hear that we have the closed heads, the loop, and the snare. And then later on we go to the high energy part of the track, and you can see fewer one-shots, more sequence stuff, and higher energy. So now that we know everything about like the structure of the track and the way that it's going to flow in the most basic form, let's see if we can expand on that and do some neat extra tricks to make it more interesting. Because what you've probably noticed is that this is not the Psytrance structure that we talked about before. For a start, you can see that this one is a lot shorter, even when we had the other structure that we had before, where there was like 2 more bars over here. To make each drop have 4 segments to it. Over here we have 4, and over here we have 4. And then of course we have the outro here, so this would technically be like a 5th segment of kick and bass. But this would already be the part of the track where the DJ is mixing out your track and pushing in another track. So personally, I really like to identify that part of the track as its own unique like structural segment to it. And you'll see that even if I go up here, that I have the same thing over here. I have all of my drops in red, but you can see that we have the final outro over here where the mixing would happen into the next track as a different color. Now zooming in, the very first thing that we'll notice is, let's actually take this track over here and drop it up above so that it's easier to see the structure. It's a little bit tall. I don't know why Ableton makes these things so tall when the group is out. It would be nice for it not to do that. I don't think this is very necessary. But either way, now that we have it over here, we can see that this is actually, instead of 16 bars, we have 32 bars over here. And then we have our pre-drop segment where we actually preparing the listener for the drop that is about to happen. And then we go into the actual drop. So this is still all intro. So I'm going to play it from here because everything that's happening before it is basically just pads and stuff like that as well. Kick and bass comes in over here, of course. So in this case, you can see that we have a clear like preparation of the drop that is about to happen, in the sense that it's clear that something is about to happen when we have this big impact and it becomes almost silent. Even though the kick and bass isn't technically in this part, I would still like classify that as part of the structure that is preparing the listener for the drop that is about to come. And actually, if I go into my kick and bass over here, if I go into my kick, you can see that this is something that I experimented with, having my kick and bass also in the first part over there. But that is, through experimentation, one of those things where you're kind of slightly strafing away from the initial idea of the structure. There's more cases of that happening within this track as well. If we zoom in over here, we can see that we have our first 2 segments of the drop over here. But if we go to the kick and bass, especially in the bass, this is very visible. We can see that we have 1, 2 big fills over here, and then we also have a fill over here. which technically would be like marked like this, because it's just a fill of one beat. So this is how you would put it in the marker track if you truly want to represent the structure of this particular part of the track. But in this case, of course, I decided to just not bother with that and just say like, okay, this is a drop segment over here. And then we have a drop segment over here as well. And this leads me into a very important point, and that is that at the end of the day, you're always writing. What I really like to do nowadays is I like to lay out my structure very early on in the production stage. Usually what happens is I make my kick and bass, I make my templates and like all of the top drums and all of that stuff that I need to theoretically layer out the structure and its energy flow. So that means that I would need kick and bass, I would need the snare, closed head and open head, maybe 1 or 2 drum loops, maybe a crash and a downlifter and an uplifter. And that is all of the stuff that I really need to kind of determine the energy flow of the track throughout the whole track. Of course, at least throughout the drop segments, because that is not something that you'll often hear in the intro or the breakdown or something like that. But then I already, with those elements, go lay out the structure so that I have a structure that I can actually start writing my ideas in. And then slowly it is going to adapt more and more. And I'm actually going to start writing the track and like adding ideas to it. And based on how the ideas kind of get introduced within the track, what you'll find is that my structure is kind of going to adapt to the ideas that I'm now putting in the track. And often that is just not reflected in what is happening in the marker track. Now, another way that I'm spicing up my structure is by using different fill lengths. As we can see over here, we have a fill of half a bar over here. We have a fill of a bar over here. If I scroll a little bit further, we see a fill of 2 bars over here. We have a fill of a beat over here. There's sometimes even projects, this one isn't one of them, but there's sometimes even projects where after a drop segment, I also have a fill of maybe say like 4 bars. And one of the things that you'll again find is that in order to maintain the structure of like the whole track, what you'll find is that I'm actually carving my fills out of the segment of the drop. I see a lot of beginner producers not doing this, and it becomes really confusing to follow along with the track, because what it would technically mean, if we make an example of this, say that I just copy over a segment over here. I'm just going to copy over actually this idea over here. So this would be a good example of what it would sound like if I do it the other way. Let's say that I wanted to do 16 bars of kick and bass and then 2 bars of fill. So what I would need to do, of course, is I would need to extend this idea over here. I would need to take my fill that I have over here and place that here. My reverse crash is going to be placed a little bit later. Actually not that late, but over here. And then this stuff needs to be duplicated over as well. And then, of course, we need to extend our sequences because those also need to play in the fill. Otherwise, the fill is going to sound very, very empty. So that means that this is happening over here. And then this also needs to be extended. I don't know if I can just do that like this. No, I cannot. I can duplicate it over like that. And then, of course, after that, we can say we go into the kick and bass again. Listen to how strange that this is going to sound when we just go into the kick and bass after the fill is like extended like this. Now, I did have to adapt some of the sounds a little bit in order to actually play it. There was actually a very strong indication in some of the synths that there was supposed to be a fill here that I left in when I initially played this. So I'm going to play this whole segment now, and now you can hear how it's going to sound like, okay, this isn't complete. We're cutting off the musical idea halfway through to actually make sure that this fill is playing over here, as opposed to where it actually should be playing. Like, this sounds unnatural, right? Like, it doesn't really sound like this works from a structure perspective. And that is fairly clear if you just start looking at what is going on. We're taking an idea that is, in this case, 4 bars long with the way that the modulation works and stuff like that. And we're literally just cutting that in half. We're taking ideas over here that are 8 bars long over here, and we're just taking a fourth of that. So the repetition is all gone. The way that it repeats doesn't line up with the actual length of the segment. And you want stuff to continue playing in the fill because, of course, otherwise it would be empty. So the fill needs to be actually carved out of the drop over here. So if you want a 1 bar fill, your kick and bass is going to be 15 bars, and then your 16th bar will be the fill. Now, there are situations in which I don't use a fill. this is probably a very good example over here. As you can see, in terms of the structure, there's no fill after this segment of the drop. We straight go into the next segment. And that is because what I sometimes like to do is I like to continue some of the drums in here or create like a little build-up. And then it sounds a little bit more natural if that immediately comes out of the kick and bass. The way that this tends to work is that I almost consider this a fill. I don't really, because functionally it's different. It's like more of a build-up, right? We're moving into a new idea, we're moving into a new segment, and this allows us to transition into that segment over a little bit of a longer time. Because really, normally the idea of a fill is that you go from one idea to the next. That is what happens, for example, over here. This is a really good example of where the fill just ends one idea and then the new drop comes in and a new idea starts. This is a very emphasized version of that idea in that the melody kind of hits on the first kick drum and it immediately like opens up and becomes bigger and it becomes like this, almost like a wow moment. There's this sudden massive melody. And the way that that works is that we're cutting stuff out in the fill so that we are creating space for the new elements to come in. And then when the first kick hits, all of those new ideas come in and they can immediately capture the attention of the listener so that they can, again, start dancing and they can say it like, oh, wow, there's some new cool stuff happening here. And in my opinion, that is also the reason why it's so important that you often change elements when you're actually having a fill. And in my opinion, therefore, it's also so important that you often change elements and especially that you have contrasting elements. Like these two elements over here are very contrasting, of course. You have this almost tiny psychedelic, like plucky sounding, like 16-note sequence happening, and then suddenly that cuts out and we have this bigger melody coming in that takes over and is like really modulated and really phasing around and that kind of stuff. So that is completely different in terms of the actual like idea that you're going to get from segment to segment. Now, another thing that you can do is you can strafe away from the 16-bar idea by using something like either 32 bars or like what I've done in this case, which is 16 bars. In this case, this is fairly special in that the stuff that is happening over here almost sounds like it's still part of the drop. I'll play that later and then you'll hear what I mean. But this is kind of like a build-up in a way that still somehow uses the kick and bass as well. So technically the length of the actual drop part, the part where people are actually like dancing to the kick and bass, is going to happen over here, which is 24 bars long. Now, I actually recently changed this, so there's a fill in here now. So this is no longer really what the structure is doing. You can now imagine it as a part of 16 and a part of 8 right after. So something like this. But of course, if I just let the kick and bass keep going over here like the idea was originally, then that would still like work and it would still be a 24-bar segment. So now we have something that sounds like this. And this brings me neatly into the ideas that I'm going to have in the breakdown over here. In this particular case, the breakdown is made up out of 2 segments. When it comes to breakdown, what I find really important is that you actually break down in the sense that you don't keep the high energy up so that it goes lower and then you can actually like build it up again. What I often hear, for example, is that a lot of people keep maybe their kick drum in here, they want maybe the drums in here, and all of that keeps the energy, which is really not what the breakdown is for. You really don't want people doubting of, oh, should I be dancing or not? It is really clear like, oh, this is the moment where we take a little bit of a breather and then we'll go into the build-up over here towards the end here. There will be like a little fill over here and then we'll hear the kick and bass again, and that is where we can start dancing again. Of course, when it comes to a structure for your track, it is really, really important that the structure facilitates the dancing that people are going to do. People shouldn't be standing on the dance floor doubting themselves like, wait, is this the part where we dance or not? Often what I hear a lot in beginner tracks is, as I said before, they don't really commit to the breakdown. They don't really break down in the breakdown. And another example of that is what they'll often do is they'll have their kick and bass come filtered in over here, but towards the end, the filter is completely open. And the kick and bass is like full volume, so it just sounds like the kick and bass that is actually playing in the drop over here. What that means is that at this point, if the kick and bass is fully open and it's playing at the loudness that it was playing in the drop, people are going to say like, hey, this is the kick and bass that was just playing in the drop before. Should we be dancing here? Are we supposed to dance now? Or is this the part where it's still part of the build-up and are we going to get into the drop later on? One of the things that you need to remember about structuring stuff is that you get to see this, but the listener doesn't. The listener does not know what is going on with the DAW. They have not seen the project. So as I said before, the structure is supposed to guide you throughout the dancing part. And that is one of the reasons why I would recommend for most beginners to look into a structure that we saw before, like this over here, because it's very easy to kind of predict what is going to happen within a structure like this. If you're really rigid and you're really tight to the 16 bar part and you just keep it simple like that, then it's going to be really easy for the listener to actually like understand what is going on within the structure. Now, of course, there's other things that you can do. In this case, when it comes to the filtered kick and bass, what you'll hear is that I've really put it in the background and you can definitely hear that this is not the kick and bass that you're supposed to dance to yet. As you can hear, there's no point within this build-up where the kick and bass is like fully playing and it's at its full volume. One of the things that I always recommend in my feedback streams, and this is another thing that I want to bring up because this happened yesterday in the feedback stream as well, is that when you have the kick and bass that is supposed to be like in the breakdown, that is supposed to be filtered or transitioning in or something like that, lower it by 5 dB. It is going to work magic because there's going to be a clearer separation in the kick and bass that you dance to versus the kick and bass that you're not dancing to. Now next up, we stay in the long fill over here. This is a very classic Psytrance thing to do in that you have a big build-up and it rises up and it gets to a high point and then there's just nothing for a while and then the drop actually starts to play. In this case, I am thinking of actually making this a 4-bar fill instead of an 8-bar fill. I just think that in this case, it is a little bit too long. And we also have this little segment over here in the breakdown, which kind of separates the actual breakdown break versus the build-up part of the break. This is not something that I talked about before, but this is what it sounds like. You can hear that we get this kind of impact over here that already introduces the melody that we're about to dance to when the build-up is coming in and that kind of stuff. And then the actual build-up starts happening over here. So there's another impact over here. So there's very clear like ideas of where the structure is also in terms of the impacts. Like we have a big bass impact over here. So there's a point of interest. There's a point where you say like, okay, something has to happen over here because we just had this big impact. And then another structure point later, another 4 bars later, we have another impact. So it's again cleared like, oh, something is about to happen. We also hear like filtering in and we hear like effects coming up over here. So it is clear that all of the things are kind of helping you identify what the structure of the track is through the placement of all of the elements. And then as we saw before, we have our 16 bars of build-up. And then what we could do in order to actually make it so that this lines up with what is happening over here again, is we can just make this a 4-bar fill and then put everything 4 bars earlier, so that we get a structure that would look somewhat like this. But for now, this is still 8 bars, so we're going to continue like this. And then over here, it is again fairly simple. In this case, what we can see is we have our classic 4 segments of the drop over here, there's just a little segment in between, which is again that little build-up thing that I like to do sometimes, where it's just like 8 bars of a little pause and then we go back into the drop again. And then as I said, at the end over here, what you'll find is that we go to an outro, and this is where the track is going to be mixed into the next track for the DJ. So this is where I really try to take that into account. So you can hear very little in terms of energy. There's some one-shots in here, kind of like what we saw in the first part at the beginning of the track, where there's just a few one-shots, not too many drums. And then of course, finally, towards the end here, we have the fade out. In this case, I think I am doing some special stuff with the fade out over here. As you can hear, the musical idea repeats once more over here. And then we have our actual, like, real fade out where all of the delay tails just fade out and the sound goes to silence in the last 4 bars over here. So if you really wanted, you could just divide this up and again see that this is an 8 bar segment and that this is a 4 bar segment. So again, you can see that it's very structured. That's one of the most important things that you'll see, even though the structure isn't your standard structure. And I'm doing things a lot differently if you look at the structure as a whole. What you'll still find is that I'm still kind of like tied to the rules of the structuring and the way that the general rules work that I explained in the other video, the arrangement guide that I mentioned before. And I'm also spending a lot of consideration working out what exactly the energy level of different segments is going to be as well. That is again mainly going to help you when you think about, okay, how's the DJ going to mix this track in this segment over here, for example. But also if the DJ wants to maybe mix it in over here, is that possible as well? And maybe how is it going to sound if he wants to mix one break into another break? Is the break going to have a structure that would allow for that? And of course, the last thing that I mentioned, this part over the track over here is very important, that you have a proper outro that can actually be used to mix the track out. What I'll often see is that people kind of low pass their kick and bass, and they'll do that with a very resonant filter. And personally, I sometimes like to low pass my kick and bass as well in the outro. It's kind of like a natural way for the mixing out to happen, because it already starts to remove the higher frequencies of the parts that you're mixing out. So the track kind of naturally disappears in the other track that is being mixed in. But when you do that with a resonant filter, what tends to happen is that as the resonance closes and closes more and more and more, you get to the bass frequencies and they get much more expanded. And that can become a real issue, because those bass frequencies becoming louder and louder, of course, means that you actually have to deal with them. Now, a lot of DJs are actually going to cut the bass somewhere over here, so it might not be too much of a problem, but it's something that you have to take into account. Another thing that I would like to say is that it sounds really strange if you fade out like somewhere over here, in the sense that it would not be clear that this is the actual stop of that segment, because this is going to be the segment of the other track that is now starting to play. You can imagine that if we take this part of the structure over here and overlay it and just kind of say it like, okay, this would be the next track that would play, the very first drop that the DJ would play is probably going to be something like this, right? So this would be where the next segment of the next track is going to start. And you would probably want to line that up with something significant also happening in here. In this case, we can hear that being true. You can hear we have some atmospheres and we have like a final sound over here. And then in this case, there's still this sound playing, but usually the DJ will just cut the track in the fill over here, right? The fill of the other track would play over here, and then they'll cut the volume of this track that is currently playing, and that allows the other track to completely take over, and now you're dancing to the other track. Those are all things that you should probably take into account when you're actually thinking about the structure. And with that, we've come to the end of the track and also the end of this video. So that's going to be it for today. I hope you enjoyed this one. Let me know if you did by leaving a like, and also make sure that you're subscribed to the channel. Another way to support my content is by watching some more of my videos. So there will be 2 up on the screen right now for you to choose from. So just pick one and enjoy, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.